So I want to begin by looking at Genesis chapter 1 and seeing what this tells us about the triune nature of God, that he is more than one person specifically. So if we read in Genesis chapter 1, I want to show that the idea and the teaching that God is more than one person is not something that is only found in the New Testament, and it's certainly not something that's being read back into the Old Testament, but instead it is quite literally from the very first page of the Bible. So beginning at verse 1 of Genesis chapter 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. So, how does this show that God is more than one person? Well, very simple. However, it's something very easy to skip over if you are already familiar with what these verses say. Perhaps we don't necessarily realize their full significance. We have in verse 3, "Then God said, 'Let there be light,' and there was light." So a basic question comes to mind. When God said this, "Let there be light," who was God speaking to? The answer may come to mind. He was speaking to the light, especially if you are a Muslim. You will probably be familiar with how the Quran says that God says to a thing, "Be," and it is. So God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. He says to the light, "Be," and it is. But is that really what's going on here? I don't think so. First of all, he doesn't say "be" to the light. He says, "Let there be light." Whatever or whoever he is speaking to is other than the light, for two reasons. First of all, he says, "Let there be light." So he is speaking to the one who will let light be. That's what it means. It's unavoidable. And so he cannot be speaking to the light itself, because the light itself is not what lets light be. The light is being referred to as something other than what he is speaking to. But even putting the linguistics aside, just a little bit of common sense here. The idea that God says to a thing "be" and it is every bit as stupid as the idea of the universe bringing itself into existence. When God says to a thing "be," according to Islam, and it is, what does he say "be" to if it is not yet? If it doesn't yet exist, how does it hear God speaking to it if it doesn't exist yet? And if he says to the thing "be," he is speaking to something which doesn't yet exist. How can something which doesn't yet exist do anything? In fact, this appears to be a flat denial of God creating things. It's the thing that creates itself in response to the command of God, and things cannot create themselves. So this is not what we have going on in Genesis 1. For when God is speaking, let there be light, and there is light, he is speaking to something other than the light. This is basic common sense, really. And so he is speaking to something which has the power to create light out of nothing. In fact, this cannot be God speaking to anybody who is less than God. As God says himself in Isaiah 44 and verse 24, he created all things alone and by himself. There was nobody with him. That's Isaiah 44 and verse 24. So he is not speaking to an angel who creates light in response to his command. He is speaking to another divine person. And so we have very clearly in Genesis chapter 1, only in the first 3 verses, at least 2 divine persons. We have the one who is called God in verse 3. Then God said, the one speaking, God, let there be light. And we have the one to whom God is speaking. The one who lets light be, the one who, at the end of the verse, and there was light, created light. So we very clearly have 2 divine persons here. And this is the pattern that is repeated throughout this chapter. For example, in verse 6, then God said, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. Again, the same question, who is God speaking to? He says, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters. The very fact of using the phrase, let there be, shows that it doesn't exist yet. He's not speaking to something that doesn't exist, asking it to bring itself into being. He is speaking to another person who will let this thing become. And only a divine person would have the power to create light or to create this expanse in the midst of the waters. Again, this isn't just my reasoning. God himself says that he creates all things alone and by himself. Isaiah 44 verse 24. And so the pattern continues throughout the first chapter of Genesis. And then we come to verse 26. Then God said, let us make man in our image, according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, and rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. So, God said, let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. So, the obvious thing here, of course, is the fact that God is speaking in the plural. He says, let us make man in our image. Us and our are plurals. It implies that there is more than one person doing this. God is speaking to someone else again, and they're doing this together. So once again, even if you want to somehow dismiss the fact that God is using plurals, how are we to dismiss the fact that God is speaking? To whom is he speaking? Speaking to himself? This sounds more like a Unitarian argument misrepresenting the Trinity as modalism, saying that if Jesus is praying, is he praying to himself? Well, let us ask you the question. We believe in more than one divine person. You may not, if you are not a Christian. Who do you think God's speaking to? Himself? Let us make man in our image. Who is he speaking to? According to our likeness. And then we have the fact of the plurals. Let us make. Now, the usual response to this, of course, is to say that it is a plural of majesty, that it is like a king speaking, and he is using the plural to glorify himself, to big himself up, so to speak, and it's just to reflect how great God is. He is using the plural. Well, what about that? First of all, there's something intrinsically wrong with this argument, just logically. The very idea that God is using a plural to speak of himself, who is singular, in order to emphasize how great he is, assumes necessarily that it is somehow greater to be plural in some sense, because using plurals would not express greatness if being plural was not greater than being singular. In fact, you could almost argue that if God were entirely singular, it would be the greatest possible thing to be singular, and it would be more fitting for groups of people to express their greatness and godliness to speak of themselves in the singular. But instead, the opposite is the case. We have the fact being argued by Unitarians, by people who deny the multi-personhood of God, that there is a plural of majesty. It represents being more majestic and being greater to use plurals when you are just singular. And this is what God is doing. But this assumes that God is less great than he could be, because God, according to this way of thinking, is singular, but is making himself sound greater than he is by using a plural, or in this case, using more than one plural. So this completely fails just philosophically, but there's a lot more. There's a lot more reasons why it fails. Secondly, the word image, then God said, let us make man in our image, is in the singular. So we have plurals being used with a singular. So we see that God is one in one sense, and more than one in a different sense. He can use the plural for himself, but he also uses the singular. There is only one image, but it's shared by an us, by multiple persons. And they are together making, let us make, the plurals, the two or more, the us, are making man in their singular image. There's one image, but it is shared by more than one person, and more than one person is making man in their one image. I mean, does this sound like the Trinity or what? I mean, it is all over the text here. But of course, there is another objection. When the argument from plurals of majesty fails, no doubt people will look at post-Christian Jewish interpretation and look for a different alternative to the Christian doctrine that God is more than one person, because they will accept any explanation as long as it's not the correct one about the triune nature of God. And so they will say God was speaking to the angels. He was speaking to the angels. Well, first of all, we've already dealt with that because God created all things alone and by himself in his own words in Isaiah 44:24, and numerous times God is described as the one who is our creator. The angels are never described as creators. Furthermore, think about the implications of this. Are angels created in the image of God? Do we ever read that kind of description of angels in the Bible? No, it's not there. We're never told that angels were created in the image of God, which they would have to be if we would be created in the image of God and angels. But furthermore, as I pointed out, the word image is singular. Let us make man in our image. If there were more than one being involved here, let's say the divine being, God, and angelic beings, we would be created in their images, after their likenesses. But that's not what the text says. Let us make man in our image, singular, after our likeness. So there is one likeness, there is one image. This cannot be talking about the angels. And we are created in that one image. And interestingly enough, although I wouldn't push this too far, it goes on to say in verse 27, God created man in his own image. Notice, it's back to the singular again. Because there is one being that is God, Christianity can make sense of and incorporate the fact that God uses both plural and singular terms of himself. Whereas those who would argue against us can certainly point out, rightly so, that God uses singulars to refer to himself, but they cannot deal with the plurals, and they pit the one against the other. And there are, in some cases, various heretical groups who will maximize the fact of the plurals that are used, and yet they will have to deny what God says about his uniqueness. We do not have to do that. God is unlike anything in creation. He is unlike the angels, and he is unlike humanity. Yes, I can say that as a Christian, rightly so. And yet, he can use plurals because there is only one God, who is plural in person. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. So notice, God created man in his own image, 1. In the image of God, he created him, 2. Male and female, he created them, 3. Now, I'm not going to say that this proves that God is 3 persons, but isn't it interesting, the kind of language that's being used here? It's repeated 3 times that God created man, and it's in the singular each time. God created man in his own image, 1 person. In the image of God, he created him, 1 person. Male and female, he created them, 1 person. So 3 times we have the singular, he, being used of God in his act of creating man. Right after, we have Genesis 1:26. Then God said, let us make man in our image. Isn't this incredible? Isn't it incredible how consistent the Bible is in its presentation of who and what God is? This is not something that was made up at the Council of Nicaea. It was not something that was made up by the Apostle Paul. This is something taught from the very first chapter of the very first book of the Bible, we see God revealing himself as he truly is. This is not something that was hidden from the ages past and has only just been revealed to us or to some enlightened generation. This is who God is. This is what God has been saying about himself all along. Now, also, we have the fact that male and female are both created in the image of God. In verse 27, in the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. So we see that male and female have a particular relationship with each other, and they are together created in the image of God. Now, this says something very important about the equality of male and female under God. They are equal in nature to one another. They are both created equally in the image of God together. But it also, I think, has something important to say to us about God and the way that he is. Because a man and his wife, there is an authority relationship between them. And yet, of course, in an unfallen state, in a good relationship with things exactly as they ought to be, a husband and wife will be in harmony and in unity with one another. So you have the authority relationship, and yet you have the unity and the equality in nature, both being equally created in the image of God. And this is something that shows up in the New Testament in the writing of the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 11. And I'll read from verse 2. Now I praise you, because you remember me in everything, and hold firmly to the traditions just as I delivered them to you. But I want you to understand that Christ is the head of every man, and the man is the head of a woman, and God is the head of Christ. So, first of all, I should point out that the words used for man and woman here in Greek are exactly the same words that would be used for man and wife, or husband and wife. So it's simply a contextual choice whether to translate it as man and woman or husband and wife. So what I would like to point out is, although man and wife are both created equally in the image of God, they share exactly the same equality in human nature. There is still an authority relationship between the two of them. Similarly, we have the fact that God is the head of Christ in the same context. Now, the word God, of course, is referring to the Father in this context, as it usually is in the New Testament. Not exclusively. There are plenty of examples where the word God is used referring to the Lord Jesus Christ, but in general, the word Lord is used for Jesus Christ, and God is used for the Father. Do you have something to say, Brother Otto?
Oh, sorry, that wasn't my intent.
No problem. I just noticed you unmuted yourself, so just in case you wanted to say something. And so what we see here is that there is an authority relationship between the husband and wife that parallels the authority relationship between Christ, Jesus, and the Father. And so for any sisters in the faith who are listening to this, I should point out and it should be very much emphasized, especially in this modern world that confuses authority with inferiority, or superiority rather, that just as Christ is in no way inferior to God, absolutely not. That is heresy to say that Jesus is less than God intrinsically, that he is somehow inferior to God. No. In the same way, you have every bit equality in nature with men. Men and women are equal in nature. That men are not greater than women. Husbands are not somehow better or more worthy than their wives. There is an equality in nature here, and that is very important to be recognized. It's true that there is an authority relationship, just as we read in 1 Corinthians 11. But it's not something that should make you feel like you're being made inferior to men. Otherwise, the parallel to that would be to suggest that Jesus Christ is inferior to the Father. And this is completely against our faith. This is completely unacceptable. In fact, it is damnable heresy. Anyone who believes and teaches that Jesus is intrinsically less than the Father is damned to hell. And so you must never consider what the Bible teaches about the need for women to submit to their husbands to be thinking that it is teaching that you are inferior to men. So I just want to make a point of that. In today's feminist world, the two things are completely confused. It is suggested that for women to submit to their husbands, it means that they are somehow less than their husbands. But this is being completely refuted by the Apostle Paul in the context of the creation of man and woman in parallel to the eternal existence of the Father and the Son. So moving on, I would like to look at some other plurals that we have paralleling the plurals that we find in the book of Genesis that we have just looked at. And I'll begin by looking at Ecclesiastes chapter 12 and verse 1. Ecclesiastes chapter 12 and verse 1. This is what it says. Remember also your creators in the days of your youth, before the evil days come and the years draw near, when you will say, I have no delight in them. So many translators will render the word creator in the singular, but the actual Hebrew word is in the plural, creators. So Solomon is saying that we should remember our creators. He's saying that there's more than one of them. And yet, as I pointed out before, God says over and over again in the Old Testament that he creates all things alone, that there is no other creator. There is no other God. And angels cannot be co-creators with God. So how are we to understand this? It's very simple. In the same way that we've been understanding what Genesis teaches, there is more than one creator in that there is more than one person who created us. However, there is not more than one being that created us. There is only one divine being. However, there are several divine persons who created us. So we are to remember also our creators in the days of our youth. Now, I should point out here, purely out of fairness, that there is a textual variant in this verse. Some manuscripts do have creator in the singular. However, by using some very basic methods of textual criticism, I think it is very easy to see that the plural is the correct reading. That is, who would make the mistake when copying a text to write creators plural instead of creator? What Jewish scribe copying Ecclesiastes by hand is going to accidentally write remember your creators instead of remember your creator? On the other hand, what person would make the mistake of reading over, not as carefully as they should, the text, remember also your creators in the days of your youth, and accidentally copy it as remember also your creator in the days of your youth? It's a very understandable, very easy mistake to make. And I am suggesting that's exactly what happened. Not to mention as well that the Masoretic text that we have was post-Christian in its transmission. And so the readings found in the Masoretic text, that is the text that was preserved by the Masoretes, have been preserved by Christ rejecting Jews. So they would have every reason, if they were going to do such a thing, to copy it as remember also your creator in the days of your youth rather than your creators, and no reason to do the opposite. And it is a far more understandable and easy mistake to make accidentally as well, to copy it as remember also your creator in the days of your youth, when the plural is actually the correct reading. But God has been faithful, of course, and we do have the correct reading of his word. So further, I'd like to take a look at Psalm 149 and verse 2. Psalm 149 and verse 2. And we find something similar here. It says, "Let Israel be glad in his Maker. Let the sons of Zion rejoice in their King." And literally here, it is let Israel be glad in his makers. Let the sons of Zion rejoice in their King. Now, isn't it interesting that Israel has makers? God is referred to as the makers of Israel, implying a plurality within God, which is completely consistent with the plurality that we have seen in the book of Genesis and in the first chapter. Now, what I should mention is not only, of course, do we find the deity of the Son of God throughout the Old Testament, but we also have the deity of the Spirit. But time is getting along with us. We've been on the subject of the plurality of God in the Old Testament for 36 minutes now. So I want to thank everybody who's been listening, and I think I will probably turn this into a series rather than covering all the topics I mentioned at the beginning of this live stream. And I think I'll cover them hopefully on future occasions. But thank you for joining us, and I'll just open this up now for discussion between those of us who are here. If anybody would like to make some comments. It's nice to have a few people listening in. And does anyone have any comments to make about the subject of the plurals being used of God in the Old Testament, and particularly the creation of God, showing that he is more than one person in Genesis1, this being reflected in later references to God as our creators and our makers later on?
Yeah, I would be curious to know what the Jewish interpretation of those texts is in light of the current Jewish, because they have to deal with this text and in a different way than literally reading what it says. And I know it's probably very different from what the old Jewish teachings were, but I'm curious how they deal with it. Do you know that?
I think I've got some general idea, yeah. It's a good question, of course. From what I understand, the mainstream Jewish interpretation now is to say that it's referring to the angels. They don't use, generally, the claim that it's a plural of majesty and that these things are being used, but instead they say that God is speaking to the angels. But I don't know that they actually attribute creation to the angels, although they say he's speaking to them. I've pointed out a few problems with that, but I think that's the excuse that they run with and come up with, as far as I'm aware.
And the equality of man and woman, is that the same? Do you see that too in Judaism, the old and the new? Do you know anything about that?
Well, that's a good question. I think that in the Old Testament, we can see that put across in a very Christian way, a similar way to how Christians would understand it. But over time, I think probably due to the influence from nations around them and the general attitude in the world towards male-female relationships, the Jewish leaders became very sexist, if I can put it that way. From what I understand, there was a prayer that was recited by the Jews, which was basically, Lord God, I thank you that I was not created a leper, a Gentile, or a woman. Literally, they're praying, thanking God, thank you, you didn't make me a Gentile, you didn't make me a leper, and you didn't make me a woman. So I think at least by the time of the incarnation, by the time Jesus became a man, Judaism had become very sexist and had begun viewing women as inferior. But I think that was probably a development that took some time. Obviously, it's not taught in the Old Testament, but I think over time it evolved in that direction. I don't know where modern Judaism stands on that, but that's might be something interesting to look up. I should also mention that I was in a Bible study with an Anglican teacher. Well, I say teacher, he was some sort of a professor. And he pointed out that where it says in the New Testament, let the women learn with silence and all subjection, what would have been shocking to Paul's audience is not that he says that they should learn in silence, but rather that they should learn. The idea that women should be there and learn would be shocking to that New Testament audience, considering the view of women that Judaism had at that time. So I think what Jesus taught about women and his attitude towards them and that of the New Testament was very radical given the context it was in. But I'm not sure that it would be considered radical in certain periods of Old Testament history where Israel was following their God more closely.
And do you know how he dealt with in silence then? I'm interested in the whole passage in that sense. The professor, I mean.
Kind of missed your question there. Can you repeat that?
Your professor pointed out that the fact that women are to be to learn was the cultural shock. But how does he interpret the in silence then? I got a question frequently from Muslims, therefore I'm
I
interested
understand.
in his view.
Yeah. His perspective was that women were not trained they were not trained sufficiently to be able to teach and so forth in that context, because they didn't have the background of learning that many Christian women do have today, and that perhaps they should have had then if the culture had a better attitude towards women. And so it was more suitable for them to learn in that context because they wouldn't be trained to comment on it intelligently and to teach others. However, considering that we have developed a attitude towards women and allowed them to learn, and they are now in a position to be able to teach well. So he contextualized it to that time and place and that context. I think I'm accurately representing him as best as I can on that subject. I should say that while I'm trying to answer your question and tell you what he said and what he thought, I don't actually agree with his interpretation. I take the view that the verses that say that women should be silent in the church, I take that pretty literally and pretty binding universally. But that's my very fundamentalist take on it. He didn't agree with that, and he made the case contextually that it was something that it was right to be followed there because of their situation. So I didn't agree with him, but that's what he said, and it's not difficult to see where he's coming from. I do respect his opinion, even though I don't quite agree with it.